as I am investigating the topic of the future of work and trying to figure out where the world is going to move to in the next 5 to 10 years and what we need to do to upskill for the coming future. I'm delighted to have with us Samuel J. Klein, who's joining us from Massachusetts. Samuel is an engineer and experimental ontologist currently developing the underlay project for federating global public knowledge, co-founder of the Knowledge Futures Group, which we're going to talk about a lot more because I want to really understand what goes on at his group. But he designs ways to record and curate research that minimizes barriers to entry and addresses systemic biases. He's also served as trustee of the Wikimedia Foundation and was content director for One Laptop Per Child and built tools for translation, stargazing. And he's also an undergraduate from Harvard University. He studied physics at Harvard. This one sounds like a little bit of a child prodigy who's now become an adult prodigy. So Samuel J. Klein, super excited to have you on this and looking forward to getting a little glimpse of your amazing brain. Thank you for doing this.
So lovely to talk to you.
Okay, terrific. So Samuel, as we begin this conversation, and the book is about the future, from your vantage point, why would you consider thinking about the future? Why is it important to even have this conversation?
I think people usually make a lot of decisions based on their implicit beliefs in the future. And when they're deciding what to do, there's often a tension between what they think other people will be interested in, things they feel they'll be good at that will also benefit others. And a lot of that is bootstrapping with what you hear, you think the situation is going to be in your field or in your community. And in some cases, people set up self-imposed obstacles to what they would really like to do because they're convinced that they have to narrow their focus to things that are reasonable, or people will use the phrase things that have a future. So it's important to have a reasonable map of what's definitely coming and what's possible. And so I love the fact that you're focused on this and thinking and writing about it.
Okay, awesome. So let's first understand what it is that you do a little bit more in depth, and then we can try to contextualize, how you would look at the future and sort of what is the lens you look at the future from. So what is the Knowledge Futures Group, and what have you set out to do? What's the mission that you're on?
We did put future in that name. The Knowledge Futures Group started out as a collection of friends and colleagues who were working on tools for knowledge production and for peer production of research and articles and synthesis of other materials, trying to make it easier for people to control the whole life cycle of an idea or a discovery, from identification to investigation to describing it and getting feedback from other people. And a lot of the historical libraries and materials that we learn from and work with are static. They're made at one point. Everyone interacts with them as a historical artifact, and then some of the things that you learn from them are commentaries and analyses. And if there's enough commentary that it's important to make a new version, someone else might produce the next iteration on the same idea. And because of this, I'd say in recent decades, in the last century or so, we developed more and more elaborate review and editorial processes for making sure that static thing which gets produced is good enough, correct enough, that it's useful to a lot of people. But we live in a digital and pretty dynamic world these days, and a lot of the things that we know and talk about are continuously changing. And it would be lovely to have the same sorts of narratives and research outputs and descriptions of the world that relate to some living dashboard of observations and updated understandings of a given collection of source material, even from the same authors. So with bearing that in mind, on the one hand, and looking at how publishing got intermediated on the other hand, which our reputation was assigned to the intermediary publishers, we're just trying to build open source community maintained tools and frameworks for collective sense making to happen without needing to bring in third parties who, for whatever reason, had some conflict of interest where they didn't want knowledge to continuously be out there and be as visible and accessible as possible to everyone. So that was the context for Knowledge Futures. And the Underlay project was an effort to do similar things with knowledge graphs, building on the internal knowledge graphs at a lot of corporations. In the early 2000s, we had both MetaWeb, which turned into Google Knowledge Graph, and Wikidata, which grew out of the information boxes in Wikipedia as like collaborative public collections of statements about the world, with the idea that, of course, they're constantly changing, and you want to figure out where each new update to a statement comes from to figure out if if that new source is something that you want to integrate into your own work. So trying to make that, again, tractable to individual communities who are just working on their own data, because right now, the versions we have that are collaborative are large, monolithic, global resources that are a little bit intimidating. It's a little bit hard to figure out how to add a new property to Wikidata and then add all of the data from your pet research project to it. Do other people really want it? This is a question about the future. Are other people going to say that's ridiculous? Why should I care? Don't stuff your research observations into my global database. Or maybe they will like it, or maybe they will want to change it in a way that makes it hard for you to differentiate what other people say about your research from what you said. So all of these are the sorts of details that can be worked out, but it just needs to be made accessible and to feel each subfield needs to feel comfortable using these kinds of collaborative tools to move forward into more multi-person open collaborations.
Okay.
And if you want, we can talk about individual scientific fields where this has happened really beautifully, and individual fields where people are have been opposed to it.
I love one use case of like an individual or a community, that's using this, and how has it changed what they were doing before to now?
So I think one of the best examples of this kind of collaboration is the astronomy community, where there's a shared database of astronomical observations across all telescopes, all observers, all research projects, and it's understood that that's where new observations go. If you're publishing a paper that's going to reference some astro observations, the observations themselves will definitely be in this collective data store, maintained by a small number of research institutes. And as a result, there's no question that anytime you run across a new paper, the underlying observations are already public. They've been public since before the paper came out. In contrast, you have other fields like genetics and biology where people will publish a new paper. They will hide the data until publication because they don't want to be scooped. After publication, they might not release the full data set. They're only showing the overviews that they've distilled from the data and the conclusions they drew from that. And if you want to try to replicate the entire experiment, you can write them and you can ask for them to send the appropriate materials to you, and maybe they will say yes, or maybe they're too busy. And one of the results is replication is slower, but another result is that it's just very hard to do meta studies across the works of multiple groups. And in astronomy, you often want the extra observational power of having the composite of all the observations of a thing that happened out in space from all the places that happen to be looking at it at roughly the same point in time.
Okay, so it's sort of I don't know if I'm simplifying it, but it's sort of like crowdsourcing data and then sharing it equally, open access to everyone. And they're actually sharing the entire underlying data set as opposed to just some, eventual observation or hypotheses or takeaway from that data. You're saying they make the data itself publicly available to all.
Yes, well, that's the open data movement writ large. And one of the challenges is making sense of the the variations in how different groups talk about their data, right? Or how they talk about their publications. So with the advent of like, as we develop the ideas of open source publishing, one of the obstacles to publishing your own work is still the expectation of having a journal identifier or a paper identifier for your paper.
Yeah.
And probably the other touch point for this is the physics archive, ARXIV. This came out of Los Angeles National Labs in the US in the 90s. And at the time, already in the 90s, like, publishing of science had largely been captured by these commercial publishers who said, okay, we're not really excited about open access. We would go out of business. How would we keep doing the important work we're doing, editing and curating your work? And the author, the researchers were just like, we just want people to see our work. If that means they see the pre-edited version, that's okay. Mm-hmm. And the publisher said, I'm not sure we want to allow people to see the pre-edited version. Maybe then they won't want to read the journals. And the scientist said, well, then maybe you shouldn't be making the decisions about who has access. So a bunch of researchers just started a preprints server. They call them preprints, and they just started publishing their research as soon as they had it in a reasonable form. And in the fields that they cover, they only cover fields where they were a little bit wary about branching out beyond fields where they knew how to sift through submissions, because they do try to filter out obvious hoaxes and spam. But in the fields that they cover, it's the only place that you go for new research in computer science, AI, high energy physics, a lot of scientific fields, but then not other fields. They don't cover biology and chemistry, and they don't cover a lot of traditional CS, but they do cover AI. So it's just decisions by each subfield about whether they want to use that kind of system or whether they want to use a different system for disseminating their work. And but the essential thing that the archive offered people was a permanent identifier that everyone recognized. So it didn't look like a blog post. And associated with that, standard formatting. So what you knew that when you got a preprint, it would have it would have a method section. It would separate its conclusions from its introduction. It would have an abstract column.
So where do you see this going? Where are you seeing this movement sort of move to in the next 5 years or 10 years? How do you think it's going to shift?
Well, I think the entire universe of knowledge production is so different now than it was 2 years ago. The rate of synthesizing and producing new things, thanks to the rise of competent generalized AI tools that allow people to do much more cross-disciplinary work, means that whereas you used to essentially be publishing whatever your research area was, you were publishing with other people who used a fixed set of methods. Now you could also be doing half a dozen other associated techniques. You could expand horizontally to cover a huge range of types of research that touch on what you care about. And it no longer makes sense to say there's only we know the 50 or 60 reviewers in this subfield who need to look at every document to evaluate it for peer review. So we have to have more collaborative editing, analysis, review, and cross-referencing to put things in context. So I think this used to be a slightly wonky this used to be something that was somewhat of an optional issue for people because there were still a small number of top journals in every subfield. And if you just do good work, the people around you will help figure it out. And as work becomes more multidisciplinary and work accelerates a bit and people can't afford to have 6 to 12 month delays in getting their work out, everyone, whatever they're doing, needs more effective, informative, more powerful ways to broadcast their work in progress. For people who are doing work that touches specifically on, so as an example, most fields have facets of the field that can be modeled by AI systems. And just as there was this norm in the 20th century around having a clear method section and sharing your methods, now there's a norm in AI modeling for having benchmarks for models. So if you're going to identify a sub area of whatever you do that can be implemented by some AI system, you also want to develop a benchmark test suite and some associated data sets, some reference data sets, just to evaluate any model updates to see how effective they are. Maybe, and you both have model data sets and you have model challenges that they're for the benchmark that they're trying to accomplish. And that whole process is sort of an abstract process that you could apply to almost every field, most like physical manufacturing, most conceptual work, a lot of research techniques. So there's a little bit of raw data work there, but there's a lot of continuous publishing. The standard for that is, this is the last practical example, but the standard for that is like Papers with Code and Papers with Data, which is a single purpose website that only publishes preprints that have associated code and data. But some of the most popular pages on that site are the pages about a benchmark, and they will just show you every publication that reports something that might be an update against a known benchmark. And that's actually one of the primary directions of discovery. Whereas we used to have the direction of discovery as what is a great paper that everyone cites? And now one of the directions is what is a great benchmark that everyone is using to coordinate?
Okay, I see. Okay. So I want to stay on this. I know you don't love the word, but I want to stay on the data debate a little bit. So as we've been speaking to people from the large organizations who are building large scale AI models, and to my understanding, it seems like the people with the data are going to win this sort of race to the future. It seems like Google, Microsoft, Meta, they're now seizing data, right? They have all this data on all these consumers, and data will end up becoming an oligopoly of sorts, largely controlled by large corporations in the United States. Is this where you see the data race going to, and or do you see this getting democratized, and at some point either factions coming through or policy makers coming through and saying, well, hey, Google, you can't own all this data, or Meta, you can't own this data, now share this data publicly, and then that evens otherwise the power balance is so heavily tipped into 3 or 4 organizations basically having worldwide data, except for China or whatever, but the rest of the world pretty much is under their is in their hands, literally. So what do you think is going to happen? How do you think this is going to
Let's make sure that doesn't happen. That doesn't sound like a very good outcome. I'm not even sure that the members of that oligopoly would want that. If you talk to a lot of the top 10 players these days in publishing foundation models, many of them want there to be a diverse ecosystem of foundation models, just the foundation models. And you both have the question of models that can be flexibly tuned or customized for a range of environments and for a range of data. And also the ecosystem of, let's say, second layer models that draw on one or more foundation models. I don't think first, for practical uses, I think the future is definitely local data, small effective models, and healthy, continuous updating for a particular purpose. Whether you're relying, like a lot of the nuance in getting the interfacing with people right to support a channel of research, a lot of that is somewhat separable from the foundation models that you're using for one level of inference. So I think, and we've seen that the speed of open source model improvement, especially around like the growth of the open source data sets, has been very effective. And it's not clear that the private platforms which are licensing private data sets have a tremendous differential advantage simply in the realms of data. And you also have a lot of government organizations that have sort of troves of government data, or research labs that have research data, where the issue is not so much that they're not accessible to others, it's just a lot. You have petabytes or exabytes of raw data about the world. Figuring out how to distill that into a useful science model is more a practical question. Someone has to do it once. So I think the bulk of the data question, which everyone is going to rely on for the most widely used models, is primarily going to end up being a public resource. Okay. That's then a significant part of all of these members of the ecosystem. Yeah. But the issue, like the power differential that you describe, is more a question of use and user base, and whether who has access to that continuous feedback loop that allows you to fine tune things quickly for a bunch of new
models,
new use cases. Yeah, let's call them new human facing models. The foundation models, like the true foundation models, are not going to be human facing.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I think platforms will continue to develop new foundation models, and the current wave in the oligopoly are trying to make it easy for lots of different companies to build different tools that engage
tools at some cost in most cases. Like Google is charging
at some cost. Correct. So a lot of countries. So one of the things I think is essential in the near future is for states and community networks to have public AI infrastructure, which is a canonical. It's a canonical channel to use for a wide range of projects. And then if you're not doing something that requires one of the corporate pools, the standard experiments and the standard everyday tools should not need to use them. We have one of the things I've been working on in the last year is something called the Public AI Network, which is a coalition of groups that are exploring how to do this in a range of countries and states and cities, and not just traditional not just traditional government groups, but also other groups with a notion of a public and the public interest for their community. In the US and Spain and Japan, there's a collaboration around Aurora, which is just a shared compute facility, and it's producing a foundation model for text and research data, with the idea that this should be an easy tool for any researcher to use in exactly this way. And um, their compute facilities are maybe 5 or 10% the size of some of the big commercial compute facilities, but not only differing in one order of magnitude. And there are other national enterprises in France and the UK and Sweden and Canada that are similarly like identifying this as an area of infrastructure. So I think people should think of this as infrastructure in the near future.
You think governments should think of this as infrastructure, as public infrastructure?
I think governments do. I think increasingly governments definitely do, especially outside, like in some of the countries where the current successful companies are based, people can still imagine that everyone just uses commercial resources. But in countries that don't have their own national corporations, it's even more obvious that would be pretty silly. Like, I think the US is probably special because we do have a bunch of digital infrastructure that people have just delegated out. Our email, our data storage, a lot of these things have been delegated out to companies that so far have been pretty good to people. They have not squeezed people that much on pricing, but they could. They don't have any obligation.
They started to now. I got a nice email from Google recently about my storage and upgrading, and it's all starting now. They understand it, and
it's starting.
It's going to happen with AI too. It's free in the beginning.
Yeah.
They lure you in, and then your enterprise is running on one of their data sets and foundational models, and then before you know it, you're sucked in, right? So
yeah. So as a sidebar, we have a collaborative document for gathering use cases and examples and instances of policy language used by platforms or in law in countries. I just posted a link in the chat for the Public AI Network. That's the sort of thing that I'm helping run an 8-week seminar series now with people who are working in the space, and there's been a lot of it was very well received. So we might encourage the network to run continuous seminars like this for the next couple of years, just while helping regional organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, stand up the infrastructure. But to the question about the future, this is an infrastructure question already, and so people should think of it both as infrastructure and as a very promising and rapidly developing industry. And whatever your discipline is, or whatever you would like to study, if you're just getting started in understanding what there is to learn, think about this line of development, because there is so much opportunity to identify an area where a small group can make a real change. A lot of the most dramatic advances in model quality or in how they are used in research practice have come from small groups, just thoughtfully. Like the big advances have not come from the platform centers that have a great deal of compute. They have all managed scaling up good ideas once they come out. But the identification of sort of paradigm changing ideas has, even in the last few years, continued to come from small research groups or small groups of practice, just trying a lot of things. So we're in an era where trying a lot of things and observing thoughtfully can make a great impact, not just for other people, but even just for one's own research.
Okay. I mean, I sure hope there's like what you're saying is how it pans out, because you are seeing within the larger corporations, and they understand this, right? They understand the perils of large organizations. So they start spinning out small interest groups, in some cases, just 4 or 5 people, like exactly what you're describing, like within the organization, like a small pivot group that is doing exactly what you're suggesting. They're supposed to be cut off from the main organization, and they're just supposed to think about new use cases, models, etc. So I mean, these guys are they're onto this stuff, you know. So my I don't know. My fear still remains that the data will be owned by them, and they have access to consumer patterns, right? So one, what you're talking about is the base level models, but once you take the consumer data and then apply it to the model, that's where that intersection is really, you know. And how do you get that consumer data to in the hands of everyone, and how do you democratize everyday consumer data, because that's not accessible to everyone. I buy
That's
your point on the models. The models, yes, for sure.
one of the nice things about this era of models is that they are very, you can make a great deal of progress with just some few shot examples.
Mm.
A foundation model plus uh, a few dozen examples can now get you some interesting results that used to take thousands of examples that had to be cleanly categorized.
Okay.
And yeah, I don't think anyone can say what things will look like 10 or 15 years from now. But right now, uh, it is still extremely tractable for someone. If you imagine coming up with a quick application that just in a small launch gets a few thousand people to use it casually, get feedback from that about what they're doing
Okay. Okay. Fine. Fair
in
enough.
research commercially. And most of what's missing in a lot of these systems is still just care, right? Being really being attentive to making the outcome and the outputs good for some purpose.
Okay.
Most of the large scale things, they're just like people are trying to get something that just works generically for everything, and it's very. I continue to be satisfied that small groups can actually really solve their own problems for a time.
Okay. Okay. Fine. Okay. All right. Okay.
Which it was not clear that this would be the case. I would say like 2 or 3 years ago, there was a real concern that the only way anyone would be able to make progress would be to have a huge amount of compute and resources to do anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I completely buy that argument. Can we talk a little bit about, like, you know, as you're doing this work, and as you're bringing these forth back, what is the role of policymakers? How can they sort of aid and support this sort of movement? Is there any support as of now? And what do you see happening in the future in terms of policy making, legal governance, that side of it?
Well, there's governance within the communities, and there's governments at the state level. There's a huge demand for skill and experience with governance of systems. I think that's just generally it's a very broadly useful skill and comparable to knowing how to program. Coding is a broadly useful skill for anything that one might try to encode or automate. And understanding system design, feedback mechanisms for basic local governance in small groups, similarly very important, and can make a huge difference between systems that sort of spiral out in some sense or don't converge to a useful equilibrium, and those that do. Some of the policy questions probably one of the biggest challenges in the policy space is we have a lot of policies that make that start with some founding assumptions about constraints and resource limitations, and in knowledge production, a lot of the policies around sharing and collaboration and authorship were designed for non-collaborative environments. And if you're designing for a world where most works are produced by a single person who then has to find an agent to help get it out into the world, you build a lot of laws to protect people from being taken advantage of by their agents. And that's where we get a lot of like last century's IP laws. And in regulation against anti-competitive, like in trying to regulate for effective markets, people have all this language around monopolies and oligopolies and so on. And they spend more time, a lot of the historical language talks about the structure of the players in the market as opposed to what's happening to the surplus that's produced. And I think we're entering a regime where the thing that can be observed and the thing that's most salient is different. So if you're in a field where most papers have 1,000 authors, you don't want reuse, reuse laws that require like every individual to sign off on all possible reuses. And I think the surplus question is actually a lot more important than, in some ways, than the monopoly question. So there's also a lot of supply chain. There are a lot of supply chain details that are actually very close. They're much closer to the surface of what affects individuals than in many other arenas. And you see a little bit of this in people in non-technical spaces talking a lot about how much is being invested into manufacturing plants and energy production plants and compute facilities. So some of those things, I mean, there are countries where those things are not even considered of interest. They're not considered of national interest, right? There's a category for natural resources, and then there's another category for things that come out of factories, and they're just not the same. But in this case, there's sort of, there are these other critical layers that many countries don't have a very clean way to think about. So what I like about the policy network that we've been having conversations with lately is if you look across 20 or 30 or 50 countries, some of them actually have very clean approaches to this, or they've thought about it very, very carefully. Or for some of them, there is one national player who happens to be the world leader, and so they have a different approach. They still see it as a resource, but it's a resource that's on their side, right? NVIDIA is NVIDIA is very much a company of one country, and so I'd be curious how you see that. There seem to be a lot of echoes there of some of the early shuffling about in when people dealt specifically with oil, between when it was considered a potential resource and when it was considered sort of a universally relevant resource.
Okay. All right.
But I think that relevant to this conversation is like, these are issues that most people would not think were relevant to their field if what they're doing is science or non-computing manufacturing. And actually, some of these things might be. So.
Okay. All right. I'm going to move over. Last sections we're going to talk about. I think you touched upon this a little bit in terms of skilling, right? Like a lot of the book is focused on like what's going to happen and like what should someone who's young in high school, maybe in college, be, in terms of skilling, how should they be thinking about skilling themselves? I know you have an undergraduate degree in physics. What would you recommend somebody study today if they're going to be sort of future ready? What would you recommend that they go and get a degree in? What should they be skilling in? What's your thought on that?
I think everyone should learn a little bit about land use and manufacturing. I think those things are, and everyone should learn a little bit about the mechanics of running computations at an organizational scale, just to have a sense of what that means, because so many organizations have it as a necessary sector that like people don't want to engage with too closely. They have someone who handles everything for them, right? They have their lawyer and they have their IT department, and people try not to get on their bad side. They need them sometimes, but having an understanding of what sorts of IT policies are relevant to one's work, I think, is becoming, like, in knowledge work. This is not for all fields. That's becoming very generally useful, the way that an understanding of mathematics was a generation or two ago. And I would say learning how to communicate with your peer community, like learning the mechanisms for fast feedback from others, is much more important than people give it credit for, especially in traditional schools. Because now, coming up, like, if you have a healthy feedback environment, the time it takes from idea to market, or from idea to, like, implementation with people who you don't know helping, can be weeks. And if you don't have those networks, you just wait until you have a breakthrough with your own team. So practice describing an idea, iteratively publishing incremental work in a way that other people want to collaborate on, and getting to some outcome that you couldn't have gotten to yourself. You have to experience that a few times before you have internalized how that might be relevant. And it's also so useful just for learning, even for students who are in school.
Okay, great. Okay, put on your voyeuristic hat, and if you had to just think about, like, careers that are going to come out in the next 4 or 5, 7 years that don't even exist today, like, are there new career segments, categories, titles that you're seeing emerge?
I think that city development from scratch is becoming more relevant and practical again. Mm-hmm. There's much more movement for climate, for war, for other reasons, and also the marginal cost of city scale construction is going down. Mm. And for people who don't have the language of construction in their vocabulary, it's a real obstacle. You need others to allow you to build a new center. Mm-hmm. And I think it's possible to think at that scale, or to think at the scale of changing the utilization of neighborhoods in a way where the limiting factor is planners, builders, and the physical glue code, the glue systems that allow all these things to happen. Like in theory, it's possible to do things like we were just talking about fab design for hardware, but it's possible to do a lot of those things much more easily than the known templates that everyone adopts. And if you look into why a lot of those industries haven't changed in a few decades, people say, well, it's actually very hard. There's a lack of skilled labor who knows how to do things in a different way, et cetera, et cetera. But now the speed of scaling up in a new direction is also dropping. So there are a lot of areas where people have not gone into the field because they didn't feel like it was necessarily promising, or they felt it wasn't possible. They thought if it were possible, someone else would have done it. And now all at the same time, these things are becoming possible. They're becoming easier. And the real distinction is whether people filter it out. They tell themselves it's not possible, or they decide they're going to do it. So,
okay, so you're saying migration, you're seeing movement, you're seeing urbanization,
right? Yeah, yes, land use, organization, human social coordination, social organization, because often this means you have to pick the elements of an incorporated city that you need to deploy so that the thing that you're building still functions. There's a little bit of that governance coming in again. And in the purely digital space where there's no physical environment, again, you need to understand enough about what kinds of governance lead to stability that allows you to stand up a new community that's healthy. And here we see even the big platforms, like even some of the very well-funded platforms that start an entire new community and get a lot of use, they fall apart because they don't, really all they needed were a dozen people with competent coordination experience, which they don't have.
So it looks like negotiators, collaborators, new age diplomats, going to work again. You're saying there's different factions, and someone needs to sort of either they work together collaboratively just by instinct, or there's someone who comes in and then sort of ties it all up.
And there's a flavor of all of that which feels a little bit like what people have called prompt engineering. Once you have it in fields where there are some dominant tools that speed up construction or analysis or inference, the difference between framing what you need carefully and framing it casually can be 100-fold difference in outcome. So it's a flavor of mediation, of being a mediator or a translator between systems. And some of those systems are literally AI systems, but many of them are not. And this too is a learnable skill. And we don't quite have a name for it yet. So I don't know of anyone that's offering degrees in this, but when you meet someone who is good at it, it's tangible. They can teach it to the people around them.
They're teaching it. There are courses on this now. There's courses on prompt engineering now. They're floating around as we speak.
Yeah. So literally for LLMs, people have it, but they don't quite have it. I think if we name a discipline for this, it won't specifically be about LLMs, but it will be about how to help different advanced systems make the best use of one another's capabilities.
Okay. That sounds like in many ways a very humanistic skill, right? It's heavy on skill, it's heavy on collaboration. It's hopefully heavy on something that the machines won't be able to do, and we still have a job left in 10 years to do.
I think it's like climbing a tower. We're all climbing the ziggurat together. It's not really machines and people independent of one another. As soon as we define what it means to be a good system whisperer, you can definitely train systems to help you do it better.
I like system whisperer. That's good.
Yeah.
Good. That's a cool. I'm gonna quote you on that one and put that in the book. Okay, terrific, awesome. Samuel J. Klein, this was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas, your energy, your thought, a little snippet of your brain. This has been very, very helpful, and I'm delighted to have had this opportunity. I will most definitely keep you posted on the progress we make, and
thank you.
We'll hopefully see you in India very soon.
That would be great. And if there are any, I love indexes and outlines. if you have anything like that at some point.
Yeah, if you like, I'm very happy to share.
That would make it would make good reading. It would elevate the thought process.
Done, done, for sure.
So good to meet you.
Okay, thank you.